The room was meant to be a forum of order, but it didn't take long for chaos to steal the spotlight. Cameras clicked, lights glared, and every seat was filled with anticipation. At the center sat Jasmine Crockett, her papers neatly aligned, her voice steady as she began to speak. But before her sentence could even find its rhythm, a sharp interruption cut across the chamber. Stephen Miller's voice, louder than protocol allowed, snapped through the air. Gasps rippled from the audience. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, while others shook their heads in disbelief. It wasn't the first time Miller had been accused of bulldozing over opponents with arrogance. But the brazenness of doing it here, in full view of the nation, was startling. Crockett paused, her eyes fixed on him, her composure unshaken even as his words crowded hers. The chairman's gavel tapped once, twice, a polite reminder for order. But Miller wasn't interested in order. He was interested in dominance. His interruptions weren't mistakes. They were tactics, calculated bursts designed to unnerve, to rattle, to send a message: your voice doesn't matter as much as mine. Yet in that moment, something else stirred. The murmurs in the crowd weren't just frustration, they were a recognition. People could see it. The imbalance, the arrogance, the attempt to strip dignity from someone who had earned her place at that table. Narration cut through the noise, steady and deliberate. 6 times he would try to silence her. But on the 7th she silenced him, forever. The camera panned to Crockett, her expression unreadable, but her silence louder than his noise. She let him talk, let him try, let him show the country exactly who he was. Because Crockett knew what few in that chamber could yet imagine: dignity doesn't panic. Dignity waits. The air felt charged, like a storm hovering just out of sight. Every journalist scribbling notes knew this wasn't just another exchange. It was building toward something, a moment that would not only define the hearing, but leave echoes far beyond these walls. And as Miller leaned forward once again, voice rising for yet another interruption, the story shifted. Because that was just the beginning. This wasn't just another committee hearing tucked away in the machinery of government. It was a showdown that carried the weight of policy, power, and identity. The nation was watching closely, because what unfolded in that chamber spoke to questions far larger than a single policy debate. The issue on the table carried consequences for immigrant families, for marginalized communities, for the very way America understood fairness and belonging. That is why the cameras were there, why every headline writer had left a blank space on the page, waiting for the spark that would define the day. Stephen Miller knew this. He thrived in the theater of politics, often seizing moments to drown out reason with volume. His interruptions weren't random, they were his brand. To Miller, talking over Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply about disagreeing with her. It was about diminishing her, making her words seem less worthy of space, less deserving of respect. But those watching could see the symbolism layered into each cut off. Every time Crockett opened her mouth and was steamrolled mid-sentence, it was a reminder of the struggles women face when their voices are dismissed in rooms dominated by men. Every raised tone and aggressive interjection carried undertones. The weight of gender imbalance, the sting of racial power dynamics, the historic pattern of arrogance directed at women of color who dared to speak truth to power. And that's why the hearing mattered. It wasn't just about one proposal or one exchange. It was about the culture of interruption itself. The idea that authority grants someone the right to silence, rather than listen. For viewers at home, this wasn't theoretical. They saw their own experiences reflected in Crockett's calm persistence. They saw boardrooms where their voices had been ignored, classrooms where they had been underestimated, kitchens where they had been spoken over. Crockett, seated at that table, became a mirror for millions. The energy in the room grew heavier with each clash. Lawmakers shifted in their chairs. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing that the story was escaping the usual boundaries of procedure. The interruptions weren't merely rudeness, they had become symbols of something larger. A duel between arrogance and dignity, between the brute force of volume and the quiet confidence of restraint. And the public could feel it. Phones buzzed in laps as viewers texted friends. "Are you seeing this?" Clips were already being cut, shared, and circulated before the final gavel had even dropped. The story wasn't waiting for tomorrow's headlines. It was being written in real time, hashtag by hashtag, share by share. Because this wasn't about a woman being interrupted. It was about a nation deciding whether it would continue to accept that imbalance or demand something different. Miller's interruptions, meant to assert dominance, were instead revealing weakness, the weakness of a man who feared being bested not by louder words, but by stronger truth. And as Crockett sat there, refusing to match his volume, refusing to be pulled into his theater of noise, she was crafting her own power. The quiet before her 7th line was building its own gravity, pulling every eye, every lens, every heartbeat toward her. The moment was about to become bigger than the room. It would shape the week's headlines, it would spark conversations across dinner tables, it would remind millions why composure in the face of arrogance matters. And the country, whether ready or not, was about to witness it. To understand why Stephen Miller's interruptions carried such venom, you have to step back and look at the man himself. He wasn't just a random advisor or a passing figure in Washington. He was one of the most polarizing architects of the Trump era, the shadowy hand behind some of the most hardline policies America had seen in a generation. Immigration bans, family separations, detention camps at the border. His fingerprints were everywhere, and he never shied away from owning them. In fact, he embraced the outrage, wearing public criticism like a badge of honor. From the start of his career, Miller built an identity on confrontation. As a college student, he was known less for collaboration and more for provocation. He sought out debates not to find common ground but to dominate. Every interruption, every sharp insult, was a tool to tilt the playing field in his favor. That same instinct followed him into the White House, where he rose not because he smoothed tensions but because he escalated them. His public image became unmistakably sharp suits, sharper tongue, and an air of superiority that seemed designed to unsettle. He spoke the language of order, insisting that he was defending the nation from chaos. Yet in practice, it was chaos that kept him alive politically. Each time outrage swirled, each time protests filled the streets, Miller was back in the headlines, reinforcing his brand as the man willing to push the boundaries of cruelty for the sake of control. It wasn't only about policy, it was about persona. He cultivated the role of the antagonist, relishing the discomfort he created in others. He knew that by interrupting, by cutting people off, by talking over them, he could project dominance, even if he had no real argument to stand on. To Miller, intimidation was debate. Volume was truth. But this image came with contradictions. Here was a man who preached about the need for rules, yet his own behavior thrived on breaking them. He scolded others for disrespect, yet his own interactions were drenched in contempt. He sold himself as a champion of American greatness, yet his tactics betrayed deep insecurity, a fear that calm truth could unravel the fortress he tried so hard to build around himself. That insecurity was visible in every interruption of Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't just political disagreement. It was a desperate attempt to hold onto a narrative he couldn't control. She was a young, rising voice who carried herself with the very composure he lacked. And that, for Miller, was the greatest threat of all. Because composure isn't easily dismantled. Still, Miller believed the same strategy that had carried him through countless battles would carry him again: throw the opponent off balance, seize the microphone, turn the spotlight into a weapon. For years, it had worked. For years, others had stumbled under his barrage, giving him the appearance of victory. But arrogance has one fatal flaw: it always underestimates dignity. And in this chamber, with the cameras rolling and the nation watching, Miller was about to discover what happens when arrogance collides with someone who refuses to play by his rules. The interruptions he wielded so casually were no longer just noise. They were becoming evidence of the imbalance, evidence of the bullying, evidence of a man so obsessed with control that he exposed his weakness in trying to grasp it. As the exchanges grew sharper, Miller leaned harder into his persona, convinced that sheer force of personality would be enough to tilt the day in his favor. But what he couldn't see, what millions watching could already feel, was that his tactics were backfiring. Each raised voice, each sharp cut off wasn't silencing Crockett, it was amplifying her. And soon the arrogance he wore like armor would crack. Because dignity, patient and deliberate, was waiting for its moment. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat under the blinding lights of that hearing room, she had already walked a path lined with battles few could imagine. Her story wasn't one of privilege or easy access. It was a story of grit, of a woman who carved her way into spaces not built for her, carrying not only her own ambitions, but the weight of generations who had been told they didn't belong. She started her career not in the marble halls of Washington, but in courtrooms that smelled of dust and desperation. As an attorney, Crockett made her name defending those who couldn't afford the luxury of powerful lawyers. Tenants pushed out by landlords, young men pulled into a justice system stacked against them, families caught in the cycles of poverty and prejudice. Each case tested her resolve, not just because of the law, but because of the constant reminder: the system wasn't designed to give people like her an easy win. In those courtrooms, interruptions weren't new. Judges, opposing counsel, even the weight of stereotypes tried to crowd her out. But time and again, she found her strength not in shouting over the noise, but in cutting through it with clarity. Where others expected her to falter, she steadied. Where others assumed she'd bend, she straightened. Slowly her reputation grew, not as the loudest voice, but as the one who couldn't be shaken. Her work as an advocate pushed her even further. She championed causes that weren't safe for political careers: racial justice, immigrant rights, protections for women overlooked in systems run mostly by men. She spoke for people who rarely saw themselves reflected in power. And for that, she was often met with skepticism, sometimes hostility. But Crockett didn't confuse hostility with defeat. She knew that every barrier she faced was a reflection of how badly change was needed. As she transitioned into public service, her journey became larger than just herself. She wasn't merely an attorney anymore, she was a trailblazer. A black woman in politics, standing tall in chambers where too often voices like hers were expected to sit silently in the back. Each speech, each policy fight, each moment under scrutiny added to the picture. Here was someone who didn't just survive the storm. She learned how to use it. Those who followed her career came to expect a certain resilience. She didn't grandstand for the cameras. She didn't crumble when critics circled. Instead, she carried herself with a composure that seemed almost disarming in today's era of political theater. That calm wasn't naivety. It was her shield, her strategy, her way of refusing to let opponents dictate the terms of her presence. It's why the clash with Stephen Miller carried so much weight. For Crockett, interruptions weren't new. But this wasn't just any opponent. This was a man with a legacy of exclusion, someone who had spent years crafting policies that cut at the very communities she had dedicated her life to defending. His arrogance wasn't just personal, it symbolized a system of voices talking over hers, over people like hers for centuries. And yet, Crockett didn't walk into that hearing to fight on Miller's terms. She didn't need volume to match his volume, insult to match his insult. She had something sharper, something that her career had prepared her for at every turn, the ability to let arrogance reveal itself, and then dismantle it with poise. By the time she sat in that chair, papers aligned, expression calm, she had already won countless unseen battles. The kind that don't make headlines but leave scars. She had been doubted, underestimated, written off. And every time, she responded not with collapse but with quiet strength that only made her harder to defeat. That's why people rooted for her even before the clash unfolded. They knew her journey, or at least felt it, watching her hold her ground in spaces that had tried to push her out. They recognized the weight she carried, the way she represented, not just herself, but the possibility of something bigger, a politics where dignity could still stand taller than arrogance. So when Miller cut her off, once, twice, 6 times, what looked like interruption to him was something else to her. It was confirmation. Confirmation that he had no argument beyond noise. Confirmation that his so-called power was brittle. Confirmation that this was the very moment her years of preparation had led to. Because this time, her calm wasn't weakness. It was the weapon. The hearing room had already grown thick with unease, the kind of tension that makes every cough, every shuffle of paper sound louder than it should. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, steady in her delivery, making her point with the quiet authority that had long defined her style. And then, the first interruption came. Stephen Miller, his voice sharp, cut across her mid-sentence. The room stiffened, eyes darted from her to him. Crockett paused, drew a breath, and picked her words back up. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to, but the seed of disruption had been planted. Moments later, the second interruption struck. Miller, louder now, slicing through her testimony like his words alone could erase hers. This time, a low murmur rippled across the chamber. People exchanged looks, not surprised, but unsettled. The pattern was forming. Crockett's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed even, the kind of calm that only sharpened the contrast between them. Then came the third. He didn't even let her finish a sentence. His tone swelled with impatience, dripping with the arrogance of someone who believed domination equaled victory. A few lawmakers shifted in their seats. The committee chair's brow furrowed. Crockett pressed on, refusing to be rattled, her eyes fixed forward as if she could see beyond the noise to something larger at stake. The fourth interruption broke like a crack of thunder. This one was louder, angrier, designed to fluster, to provoke. Crockett stopped mid-word, looked briefly at the chair, then back to Miller. The silence that followed was telling. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reactive outburst. Instead, she chose the harder route, patience in the face of provocation. The murmurs grew louder now, spectators whispering, some shaking their heads. The fifth came almost immediately after. Miller's voice rode over hers as though hers simply didn't exist. That was when the racial undertones, the gender dynamics, the imbalance of power, all crystallized in the minds of those watching. This wasn't just a man interrupting a woman, this was history echoing in real time. Crockett's face remained poised, but her eyes flickered. The kind of flicker that says, I see exactly what you're doing, and I'm not moved. By the sixth interruption, the tension was palpable. The chair raised a hand, irritated now, trying to restore order. Mr. Miller, allow her to finish. But Miller didn't retreat. He leaned forward, pushing harder, convinced that volume would equal dominance. The air inside the room was electric. Committee members exchanging glances, spectators holding their breath, waiting to see whether Crockett would finally break her calm. whether she'd raise her voice or slam her papers down in frustration. But she didn't. With each cut off, with each attempt to drown her out, Crockett only seemed to grow steadier. And in that steadiness was something unnerving for Miller, though he couldn't see it yet. 6 times he had interrupted her. 6 times he had tried to shout her down, to assert control with nothing but noise. And 6 times she had endured it, unflinching, unyielding, showing the room, and the nation beyond it, that silence under pressure isn't submission. It's strategy. The murmurs had become a buzz now, spreading from the audience to the lawmakers themselves. Reporters scribbled notes faster, cameras angled closer, the stakes climbing higher with each interruption. Everyone knew the next exchange would decide more than just the flow of testimony. It would decide who truly held power in that room. And then came the 7th interruption. The one that changed everything. For a moment, it felt as if the room itself had stopped breathing. The 6th interruption still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, and every eye turned toward Jasmine Crockett. Would she snap? Would she finally let her composure crack under the relentless pressure? Instead, she did something more powerful. She paused. Not the pause of defeat, but the pause of someone who knows the next words will matter. She let the silence stretch, her eyes fixed squarely on Stephen Miller. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the stillness, the gathering force in her expression. And then, with a voice steady as steel, she began. "Mr. Miller," she said softly, almost disarmingly calm, "you've interrupted me 6 times now, and each time you've tried to silence not just me, but what I represent." The room went stiller somehow, as if even the walls were leaning in. Miller blinked, caught off guard by the quiet authority in her tone. She continued, her words slow, deliberate, chosen with surgical precision. "You talk over me because you think volume equals truth. But history has proven the loudest voice is rarely the right one." Her gaze didn't waver. Every syllable landed like a gavel strike, cutting sharper than any raised voice could. Miller shifted in his chair, his arrogance suddenly colliding with an unfamiliar weight, the realization that noise could not drown dignity. "And let me be clear." Crockett pressed on, her voice rising just enough to carry. "When you interrupt a woman of color who has earned her seat at this table, you are not exposing my weakness. You are exposing your fear." The words rippled through the room like a sudden gust of wind. Gasps, sharp intakes of breath, heads turning. Even the chair leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Miller opened his mouth, as if to fire back, but nothing came. Crockett didn't rush. She let the silence sharpen the sting of every phrase. 6 times you've tried. 6 times you've failed. And here is what you need to understand. I will not be silenced. Not by you, not by anyone who mistakes arrogance for authority. That was the 7th line. Simple, devastating, unforgettable. The effect was instant. Miller froze, his jaw tightening, eyes darting briefly as if searching for footing that wasn't there. His combative posture collapsed into something smaller, weaker. For once, he had no interruption left to give. The audience knew it. Lawmakers shifted in their chairs, some with barely suppressed smirks. A young staffer in the back whispered, "Oh my God," while another scribbled furiously, already knowing this was tomorrow's headline. The silence broke in murmurs, first whispers, then audible reactions. Someone let out a quiet chuckle. Then came the sound no one expected in a hearing room: clapping. It wasn't thunderous, not yet, but it was enough. Scattered applause that carried the message louder than words. Dignity had landed its blow, and arrogance was staggering. Crockett leaned back slightly, not triumphant, not gloating, but centered, as if the moment had unfolded exactly the way she had always known it would. Her calm composure was its own victory lap. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth had raised itself. Miller tried to recover. He shuffled his notes, cleared his throat, forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But the damage was done. The room had felt it, the cameras had caught it, and the nation would see it. Narration slowed, almost cinematic, framing the contrast. Miller, the man who had built a career on intimidation, undone by his own miscalculation. Crockett, the woman he thought he could talk over, standing taller without ever leaving her chair. The clip would play again and again, dissected on cable news, shared across social media, captioned with words like strength, power, and mech drop. But in that room, in that instant, it wasn't about virality. It was about a shift. The kind you can feel in your bones when arrogance finally crashes against the wall of dignity and shatters. Crockett closed her folder softly, the faint sound magnified in the hush. She didn't need to say more. The point had been made, the battle won not with fury but with precision. Around her, faces told the story. Colleagues leaning back, impressed, opponents stunned into silence, staffers whispering about what had just unfolded. Miller sat rigid, his silence louder than all 6 of his interruptions combined. For years, he had thrived on control, on dominating conversations, on crafting narratives that painted him as untouchable. But here in front of cameras, in a hearing meant to showcase his force, He had been dismantled by a calm, unshakable presence. The hearing moved on technically. Papers shuffled, questions resumed. But the electricity remained. Everyone in the room knew they had witnessed a pivot point, the kind of exchange that outlives the agenda on the table. Crockett's words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a declaration. A reminder that dignity isn't passive, that composure isn't weakness, and that sometimes the most devastating strike is delivered not in anger, but in clarity. The whispers turned into side conversations. Staffers texting furiously under the table, reporters already typing the first lines of their articles, hashtags being imagined in real time. She showed him down. Was born before anyone had even left their seat. Miller, meanwhile, stared down at his notes, his pen unmoving. For once, the architect of chaos had been made small, not by louder chaos, but by order, by dignity, by a woman who refused to surrender her ground. And as the murmurs spread, as the story took root, one truth became undeniable: this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. But the real shock came after the cameras kept rolling. The moment Crockett delivered her seventh line, the ripple began. By the time the hearing adjourned, it had already swelled into a wave. Staffers in the back of the chamber had been the first to send hurried texts. She shut him down. Within minutes, clips of the exchange hit social media. By the time Crockett returned to her office, her phone lit up with notifications too fast to track. On Twitter, the hashtag appeared almost instantly: Crockett's seventh line. At first it was just a few posts, a staffer, a political journalist, a law student who had been watching the stream. But then it caught. Like wildfire, the phrase spread across timelines. By the end of the evening, it wasn't just trending in Washington, it was the #1 trend nationwide. The clip was shared with captions that spoke for millions. "This is how you deal with bullies. Calm is the ultimate power. Stephen Miller silenced by dignity." TikTok users remixed it with dramatic music, slow motion edits, even movie trailer-style voiceovers. One version, set to the sound of a gavel striking, hit 1 million views in under an hour. Late-night comedians wasted no time. By that very night, jokes about Miller's silence filled monologues. One quip: "Stephen Miller interrupted 6 times and still lost." That's not a debate, that's a bad Wi-Fi connection. Audiences roared, replaying Crockett's poised delivery on studio screens, the crowd cheering each time the clip ended. News outlets jumped on it. CNN ran the headline: "Crockett stuns in fiery exchange with Miller." The Washington Post published an op-ed titled, "Why Crockett's Calm Matters More Than Miller's Rage." Even the New York Times editorial board weighed in, noting how her poise highlighted the growing fatigue with performative outrage in American politics. Conservative outlets tried to spin it differently, calling her response overblown, but the momentum was unstoppable. The public had chosen its narrative, and it wasn't in Miller's favor. Politicians weighed in too. A senator tweeted, "Representative Crockett showed what true leadership looks like. Dignity or arrogance." A well-known progressive governor praised her, writing, "That's the composure we need in every hearing room." Even across the aisle, a handful of moderates acknowledged her restraint, though carefully, as if fearful of joining the viral wave outright. Miller, meanwhile, couldn't escape the fallout. Memes painted him as a cartoon villain suddenly deflated. One viral post showed him interrupted mid-sentence with the caption, "Error 404, confidence not found." Another simply overlaid Crockett's seventh line in bold letters above his image, stripping him of the swagger he had built his reputation on. In political circles, the damage was immediate. Reporters asked whether Miller's aggressive interruptions had backfired. Commentators on cable news panels debated what the moment symbolized: gendered power dynamics. A racial undertone exposed, or simply arrogance meeting its match. Regardless of the angle, the conclusion was unanimous: Miller had lost. But Crockett's stature rose. Not overnight, not artificially, but as the natural outcome of a moment where composure triumphed. Constituents called her office in droves, leaving messages of pride. College debate teams replayed the clip as a lesson in strategy. Activist groups shared it as an example of how patience could dismantle even the loudest opposition. For young women watching, particularly women of color, the effect was electric. Social feeds filled with messages like, "I saw myself in her. That's exactly how I want to handle my next meeting." High school students clipped the video into TikTok affirmations, set to inspirational soundtracks framing Crockett not just as a politician but as a symbol. The story reached beyond politics. Lifestyle blogs wrote about Crockett composure as a new form of leadership. Leadership coaches dissected her pause, her delivery, her refusal to let arrogance dictate tempo. A management column in Forbes praised her as a case study in tactical patience. And the impact didn't stop at admiration. Fundraising emails went out that night, highlighting her exchange with Miller. Donations poured in, small and large, from people who wanted to invest in what they had just witnessed. It wasn't about policy in that moment, it was about identity, representation, dignity, values people were eager to rally behind. Meanwhile, Miller's allies scrambled. Some tried to dismiss the exchange as overblown, others attempted to claim he was merely being passionate. But the optics were undeniable. For a man who had spent years building his brand as unflappable, the image of him silenced, blinking, jaw tight with no words to give, was catastrophic. By the end of the week, the Crockett 7 line had become more than a hashtag. It was a shorthand for victory through dignity, a cultural reference point. Late night jokes, Sunday talk shows, classroom discussions, all circled back to the same moment. And in the center of it all was Jasmine Crockett, not shouting, not grandstanding, but seated calmly in a chair, reminding America, and Stephen Miller, that power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet line that echoes the longest. But as the headlines roared and the memes spread, a new question began to surface: what would this moment mean for her future? And for the movement she had come to symbolize? When the dust of headlines and hashtags began to settle, Jasmine Crockett did something remarkable. She refused to let the moment become just a viral clip. For her, it wasn't about basking in the applause or reliving the takedown. It was about reframing what had happened, turning it into something larger than herself. She spoke of the exchange not as a personal victory over Stephen Miller, but as a window into something deeper. How power operates, how arrogance reveals itself, and how dignity can defeat cruelty without raising its voice. This wasn't about me, she told a reporter in the days after. It was about reminding people that truth deserves space, that accountability deserves to be heard, and that no amount of interruption can erase what is real. Her words cut through the noise of political spin. They reminded audiences that the scene wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of values. On one side, a man who had made a career out of intimidation, who believed authority came from dominance. On the other, a woman who showed that composure, steady, deliberate, grounded in respect, could not only withstand arrogance but undo it. And that was the universal takeaway. Dignity is stronger than arrogance. Composure outlasts cruelty. The quiet truth spoken clearly can echo louder than 1,000 interruptions. For audiences watching, that message hit home. Parents shared the clip with their children, not as entertainment, but as a teaching tool. This is how you deal with bullies. Educators played it in classrooms, sparking conversations about leadership, respect, and the courage to remain calm under pressure. Community leaders folded it into talks about resilience, pointing to Crockett as a living example of what it means to carry yourself with dignity when provoked. The lesson spread beyond politics. In workplaces, in schools, in families, people began to see the moment as a mirror for their own struggles. How many times had they been talked over in meetings, dismissed in conversations, or drowned out by someone louder but not wiser? Crockett's 7th line became more than a rebuttal. It became permission to believe that calmness is not weakness, but strength. And this is where the emotional crescendo landed. Viewers who had felt small, unseen, or silenced in their own lives now had a reminder: power is not in the shout, but in the steadiness of your truth. You don't have to match arrogance with arrogance. You don't have to fight cruelty with cruelty. There is another way. A way that leaves you whole, a way that commands respect without demanding it. For a nation exhausted by shouting matches and political theater, Crockett's moment was a breath of air. It wasn't just politics, it was possibility. The possibility that dignity could still stand tall, that truth could still cut through the noise, that calm composure could still move people more than any insult ever could. And as she reflected, Crockett left the public with a reminders. Because what happened in that room wasn't just politics, it was a lesson for all of us. Stephen Miller interrupted Jasmine Crockett 6 times. 6 times he tried to drown her out, to overwhelm her with arrogance and noise. But on the 7th, it was Crockett who spoke, and with a single line, calm and devastating, she silenced him. That was the moment everything shifted. This wasn't just a clash in a hearing room. It was a story as old as power itself: arrogance against dignity, cruelty against composure. And once again, dignity proved stronger. Miller's interruptions may have been loud, but Crockett's truth was louder. Her calm didn't just survive his attacks, it turned them back on him, exposing his weakness for the world to see. That's why her 7th line lives on. Not as a soundbite, not as a clip lost in the shuffle of news cycles, but as a reminder that arrogance always underestimates the quiet power of truth. And when truth speaks, with composure, with clarity, with unshakable dignity, arrogance falls silent. So let this moment inspire more than applause. Let it remind us of the power we all hold, the ability to stay rooted when others try to shake us, to let calm carry more weight than cruelty, to trust that truth, in the end, always wins. If you believe in that power, if you believe truth will always silence arrogance, then subscribe. Share this moment so more people remember that dignity is not weakness, it is strength. Because Stephen Miller interrupted Jasmine Crockett 6 times. But her 7th line, that line shut him down. and reminded America what real power looks like.